Okay, here we go. Um, Interesting um, weekend in sport. The French Open tennis has commenced, and there's been a lot of criticism from the tennis players playing about the conditions and the state of the balls. And so the French Open tennis is starting in September. That's interesting. Notice the Tour de France took place in September as well, and that's to do with the French government. The EFL and Premier League are still in discussions over a financial rescue package for lower league clubs. There's also been an open letter being signed by various figures in the game, directed towards the government, about the government also needing to pump in some financial assistance. Clubs are going to go bust. Plain and simple. The situation in the lower leagues is desperate. On the rugby league side of things, we now know who's going to be playing who in the NRL final series, and the Broncos have signed, or look likely to sign, Kevin Walters as their new head coach. Interesting story there. Obviously, there's still the fallout from Qantas announcing it's no longer going to be sponsoring Rugby Australia. That's another organisation in financial turmoil, along with all the others. And VAR, the VAR debate continues to rumble on in football after the weekend's disastrous use of VAR. Tottenham game, which I didn't see, but I've read enough about it to basically have a rough idea that fans and experts are getting more frustrated with how VAR is being implemented, used, and I just have to look at the news to see this isn't working. The amount of headlines about VAR, it's just not working. Plain and simple. It's not being used appropriately. The rules, why do they have to tinker with the rules in 2019? Because it's created more confusion than was already existing. And fans are left confused and frustrated. Coaches are left confused. Players are left confused. The whole thing has been badly implemented for the last couple of years. They were on a good track in the World Cup in Russia 2 years ago, and they've taken backward steps since then. There's been a few articles that have popped up. The Rugby Players Association is asking for government assistance in regards to financial assistance. We know that the home nations have said without the Six Nations getting completed and this Eight Nations tournament without fans, they risk losing around 60 to 100 million in revenue from lack of fans in the stadiums. That is concerning. But there's the Welsh game itself has been in financial difficulties for quite some time, dating back to the early days of professionalism. There's been issues with the structures financially and the money side in Welsh Rugby Union at club level and at provincial level. There's issues with finance. So if we're talking about the lower levels of the game, there's been issues with Welsh Rugby Union for a very, very long time. Money is just not financially viable anyway, and this is before COVID. It's the structures financially. This is where the debate about rugby union going professional in '95, how it hasn't actually had the benefits it should have done all those years ago, 25 years ago. The issues still crop up, keeping the game financially viable, and now we've reached a point where you can't just keep kicking the issue down the can down the line. You can't keep pushing the issue off because now it's here, it's real. So God knows what Welsh Rugby Union is going to look like coming out of this. But rugby union in general is in dire financial straits, and there were concerns that rugby union was struggling financially before COVID. Again, I'm going to mention Augustin Pichot with on his platform. Yeah, there are some things I disagree with. The changes to the international calendar, I do disagree with that. But on the financial side, he did argue that the top end talent was getting paid too much. The finances were unevenly spread and they were unbalanced. And rugby union risked going like football down a direction where it would be unsustainable spending by clubs to overpay players, which they have been doing for a long time. And it's a mess. And yeah, I mean, I've played for my local rugby club about a decade or so ago, back in 2010, 2011. When I went back to college, I played for my local rugby club, and yes, they are heavily reliant on the bar sales and the functions. I went to a motorcycle festival at another rugby club last Easter, and they opened up their rugby club to non-rugby members to stage their event because it was the off season and they needed income during their off season to sustain them. So when they go back into season play in September, October, the money they make in the summer helps them throughout because they don't use their facilities all year round. And that they have had their incomes massively disrupted. The only some rugby clubs have obviously they allow car boot sales and other events to take place, so they can supplement their income. But they are being hammered, absolutely hammered, with the restrictions in place. And if you can't have big functions like weddings and birthday parties and big like little events like this motorcycle show that I went to, then they lose their income. This is how lower levels of the sport, including football clubs, do it as well. They have car boot sales on their grounds. They have community events because of the restrictions in place. That restricts what they can do. So yeah, the sports are in a mess. But the other issues with Welsh rugby union, even at provincial level in the Pro 14, is they can't financially sustain themselves. Yeah, as an ex-player of a rugby club, yeah, they are heavily reliant on what the bar can bring in to non-members and members. Non-members pay more. Members get a discount or whatever, but they're heavily reliant on memberships. They're heavily reliant on the bar sales because they are licensed premises. They're heavily reliant on non-rugby events as well that involve the local community. I'm not an economist, but I can tell you now that the sports industry, the entertainment industry, the leisure industry is in for a very, very tough time. And a lot of this industry is very, very seasonal as well. You'll find the summer months, they get a lot of big events because the daylight's longer, the weather's nicer. More people are going to be out about if the weather's nice. And in the winter, they rely on smaller little events like weddings and business functions and Christmas parties in order to supplement their income on non-match days and non-training session days. So yeah, they're getting absolutely hammered, absolutely hammered. So again, this is where the various rugby unions need to take account of how they've appropriated their finances, where their money's gone, and how much money they actually did pump into the grassroots game. Because the top end, the professional end, they need to take some accountability of where their money's gone. They've signed these big lucrative TV deals with BT and Sky and Premier Sports to showcase games, and now you have to ask the question: where's all the TV money gone? Where's all the TV money? Same with the FA, Premier League, the EFL, especially the Premier League. You have to ask the question: where has all the TV money gone? Have they not saved anything? Are they just asset rich and cash poor because they make massive profits? Yet the lower levels of the game have constantly been struggling with financial issues for decades. So you have to ask the question, legitimately: where's all the money gone? That question has to be asked. And there's going to be more and more pressure on these organisations to fully open up their books and declare where all the money's gone. Because if they're out asking for government assistance and they're actively asking for government assistance, then you have to, ask the question: where's the money gone? Are you not supporting the lower levels of your organisation? Where's the money gone? The fact that the Premier League and the EFL and the National League are still in discussions over a rescue package is quite concerning. There's been figures from the game, club owners, ex-administrators, ex-players, media figures saying the government needs to step in and assist as well. It's not the responsibility of a private organisation to save other private organisations. But some of these communities have already got high unemployment, deindustrialisation, social issues. These football clubs, these rugby league clubs, whatever sports team it is the focal point of that community, and brings the community together. And if they go, the knock-on effects socially and economically will be felt, because when match days are on, local pubs, restaurants, cafes, little burger vans, news agents, other industries and shops benefit from a match day. There's an economic boost to a match day. So the plan not to have fans back in attendance is not gone down well with sports, when they were being told, for the summer we're going to do these test events, here's the set date, we're going to aim for this date, and then suddenly, no, we're not going to do it now. Same in Scotland as well. There's only so long professional sports can last before teams do actually start going out of business. There is only so long things can go on. These clubs have to pay their staff, not just the players, but the non-playing staff as well. The club administrators, backroom staff, the day-to-day running of the club. They've had to furlough non-playing staff as well, and that furlough scheme ends in a couple of days. So there are plans to lay off more staff, reduce staff hours. So there is a knock-on impact without fans going to games, and the government hasn't put in a support package, not just for football, but for all sports, to assist these social institutions get through this difficult time. There's been no support package put in place. I know, talking to a few friends in the last couple of days to do with British ice hockey, the National League plans to restart their season in January. The Elite League has said they're indefinitely suspending league operations because they need a minimum of 75% attendance to at least break even. That's before making a profit. So these announcements by the government, doesn't appear to be a rescue package prepared to assist sport through this time. Other industries have had financial support and grants given, and yes, the RFL has had an emergency loan back in earlier in the crisis. I think back in April, the RFL secured their short-term loan, but in order to pay back these loans, they've got to make money and they've got to be profitable. And without fans being there, you can't make a profit. You can't pay the money back as easily. So a lot of pressure has been put on the government. The debate and the question over TV rights as well, and who gets what, and how much free-to-air coverage sport gets, that's been hotly debated. And we are starting to see a drip feed of more free-to-air coverage of sport, which is a positive. But how long that lasts is anyone's guess. But it can't go on as it is. It really can't. That there is no other way to discuss to put it. There hasn't been adequate preparation put in place by the government as a backup plan should fans not be allowed in. So I don't know what we do from here, but the situation is very dire, and the Huddersfield owners' prediction back in April, May of 50 or 60 clubs going out of business looks like going to be true. It could be more. We could be talking about 100 clubs, and that includes the non-league. We could be talking to 100 plus clubs, including the non-league clubs, going out of business. So it's not good reading. It doesn't make pleasant reading. And we haven't even gotten to the actual playing, what's happening on the field with the VAR and players testing positive and some of the results we've seen. This is what's happening off the field. And there are people saying the money bubble has to burst in football. It's burst now. It burst a long time ago. The last couple of seasons have been covering up the flaws in the financial mismanagement of the sport. And questions have to be asked where the money's gone. And quite frankly, the TV deals that they've signed up and they've had, and the money they've earned off media rights, and they've changed kickoff times to suit overseas markets, which has angered fans. Where's all that money gone? So questions got to be asked from us, the fans and the fan groups, and some of the lower league clubs about the EFL and the Premier League saying, "Open up your books." That's what's going to have to happen. Do I think there should be public funding for professional sports? Well, this is where it gets interesting. I think there needs to be more fan involvement with how professional sports teams are run. Um, that's something that I think needs to happen. Public funding, though, I think what we've seen is it's a complicated balance. It really is. I think there needs to be some checks and balances um, in the system. I think what we've seen is there's a lack of regulation when it comes to professional sport. There's been, serious financial mismanagement, and in other countries there is a little bit more government involvement when it comes to, sports finance and sports governance. There has to be a more accountability um, with professional sport. Some sports have been very, very open about their struggles and have been very, very compliant and very transparent. Other sports haven't been so transparent when it comes to uh, opening up their books and transparency in some of their financial dealings, because we've seen obviously the role that agents have played, and they're very unregulated, and there's calls to regulate them and actually have regulations put in place that are backed up by law. Hang on a second, we have job news. Hello. Yes, it is. Oh, hello. I'm fine, thank you. Yeah. Where's that? Right, I know Marlo. Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I've got safety boots and a high vis jacket. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. All right. Cheers. Bye. Right. Ooh. Right. Uh. Yeah. Right about that. I've got some work for tomorrow. I've got a contract job to do. So sorry about that. But on the side of should there be public funding, we already see public funding for the Olympics and the Olympic programs, and we see lottery funding for grassroots projects. But I think there needs to be more financial scrutiny and more um, oversight, public oversight over some of the things, because what we've seen in recent months and years is, you know, massive problems with uh, financial mismanagement and uh, you know real issues where it comes with a lack of transparency. And if these organisations are going to ask for government assistance, they've got to be fully transparent. And what we've seen with football is there is a lack of transparency in a lot of their, um, you know, a lot of their discussions when it comes to where the finances go, because they sign up to these TV deals, and there is government regulation over how many free-to-air sports events take place, and protecting certain sporting events to make sure they are free to wear, similar to the anti-siphoning laws in Australia. So there is a protection there in that case. The education um, system obviously has sport in it, obviously as part of the curriculum. And so if sports teams go bust, and if these sports institutions do have financial problems, there's still going to be that education side where people do play at school and university. But it's a complicated one. How much, sport should there be? How much public funding should go into it? It's an interesting one. A lot of councils do own a lot of sports facilities, so in that case, there already is a level of public funding for sport, and professional sports teams do use these facilities. I think Widnes, their stadium, the Widnes Vikings rugby league side, their stadium's run by the council. The Leigh Sports Village, where again another rugby league stadium, I think that's had public funding. The Ricoh had some public involvement. I don't know how council taxpayers would feel about paying for professional sports athletes, but I do know sports facilities where professional teams have played are council owned and run, and they pay a lease to the landlords to use them. There's several council owned rinks, ice rinks, for example, where the teams and the people who use it obviously pay a lease. Streatham Ice Rink, for example, is council owned and run, and team and the community, obviously, when you go there, you're paying it off basically. So it makes logical sense in that case. It pays for itself. Slough Ice Rink has got council involvement. It's also council owned. So there are athletic and stadium facilities and sports arenas that are owned by the public purse. On the side of how much more public funding is required, I think there needs to be more financial oversight. I think there needs to be a bit more regulation into professional sport, because I can't see it going on unchanged, the model that we have. But then you get involved with politics and sport, and that's where it gets tricky. I think, as we all see with politics getting involved in sport, that's made it very, very difficult, in the sense that it's really created a lot of division with some of the political movements that have and how sport has got involved with it, and we do try and say professional sport should be apolitical. We've seen how politics and sport can go and become really, really used as a bargaining chip. The Olympics, for example, that's very political. So sports funding, political. I think grassroots projects are vital. There is council involvement with a lot of sports facilities up and down the country. They already exist, but I'm not sure if you stick professional sports team on the council tax bill, that's going to go down well. If you make the facilities available and they are council owned and operated through a third party, then yes, there's plenty of facilities that are council run: sports centres, ice rinks, football stadiums, rugby stadiums, and then the sports teams are the tenants, so the council can make money back without having to hike up the council tax bill for residents. I mean, it's a thing, but on other aspects, such as should public funding be used more for professional sport? I think facilities, yes, because then you don't necessarily have to jack up the council tax, because then when professional sports teams and members of the public who are maybe not council ratepayers in that location go in, it pays for itself, and then the council can make profit on that particular building. But I don't know. I think sports governance needs to be looked at. We've seen numerous sports governing bodies be dragged over parliamentary committees, especially the FA, to do with a variety of things. I remember when Mark Sampson 3 years ago got sacked from the women's coaching job with England football. There was a parliamentary inquiry into the handling and the FA structures and the handling of the whole situation. That got very political. But this is an industry that has a severe lack of regulation and a severe lack of transparency, and it's starting to catch up with it. How the reckless spending has got the sport where it is. Even if the coronavirus hadn't come along, there was only so long before the reckless overspend and the lack of real solid regulation on sport professionally would catch up with it. It's starting to catch up with it, and not in a good way. It's I don't know. I think yeah. When you talk about like politically setting in stone, funding for sport, it does create a problem. Um, and we've seen with the Olympics with Olympic boycotts, and we've seen with allegations of corruption aimed at the IOC over various things, and with FIFA, and now allegations of corruption in rugby union, well, rugby and battle pool. It does open up a whole can of worms, which I mean, how many Olympic Games have got political? There's been a lot of politics at the Olympics. Almost every Olympics since 1945, there's been a lot of politics. Every Football World Cup, there's been politics because the bidding process, who gets what. We've seen in Argentina in '78, the military dictatorship used it as a propaganda tool. What we've seen with Russia and Qatar, their propaganda tools. The IOC banning Russian athletes from competition post the Sochi Olympics. There's been a lot of political maneuverings and stuff, and it creates problems. And now what we've seen with professional sports, with various left and right wing groups hijacking social events that are going on, it creates further division. You just have to look at social media, and some sports are feeling a backlash and negative backlash. And sport is a business, professional sports business. You want to sell your product, and when you're having a negative backlash and fans are turning off, even if they can't go to stadiums, the fans are like, "We don't want this." You've got a problem. I think what we have seen is, oh yeah, I mean, look at Athens. Athens, as a city that hosted the Olympics in 2004, half the venues are crumbling. They're not even used. So when we talk about Olympic legacy, I think London 2012, okay, a lot of the venues are still used by a lot of things. They found use for a lot of the venues, whereas Athens, for example, Rio is another example. A lot of the venues quite quickly fell into disrepair and misuse and disuse. You could argue Beijing, London, they there has been a positive Olympic legacy in these cities where these venues are still being used, and Beijing are going to reuse their 2008 Bird's Nest as the Winter Olympic Stadium. So there was some positivity out of that. Turin, their Olympic Stadium has now been used as a football stadium. So it's a weird one. The Olympics, yeah, this is where there is government funding for redevelopment projects involved with sport, and they talk about this Olympic legacy as an Olympic legacy, Olympic legacy. Some cities have really benefited, others haven't. And I use Athens as an example of a city that most of the Olympic venues, apart from the Olympic Stadium, they're crumbling. The Greek economy got into real bad debt, and within a couple of years we had a banking crash, and these facilities are lying in ruins, and haven't been used for a long time. I mean, the canoeing flows, the canoe course, it's just left to rot, basically. It's just falling apart. And in 100, 200, 300 years, archaeologists will probably find the remains of these Olympic venues and dig them up. The irony behind that. But no, they pumped in so much money, and it crippled the Greek economy. Partly, there was massive. They were still finishing venues on the day the games started, and they were only used for 2 weeks, and then they were hardly ever used again. I think the only Olympic venue that is still used is the Olympic Stadium. Oh no, Sydney. Sydney's had a massive issues debate. I was reading up on the Sydney Olympics. They're already developing going to be redeveloping the Olympic Stadium (ANZ) at some point in the next 2 to 5 years. You talk about the Olympic legacy. Sydney's a difficult one. It went over budget, and it didn't necessarily bring in the amount of income it was expected to bring in. So Sydney's an interesting one. There has been some positivity in the last 20 years, but at the same time, um, it didn't necessarily leave the legacy it should have long term. With when you talk about Olympic legacy, and yeah, these are big. A lot of cities have put off bidding for the Olympics now because the bid process itself costs a lot, and then after the bidding process, you've got to build all the facilities, and then after the Olympics, you've got to find a use for all these facilities. You've got to find tenants for these buildings. You've got to keep these buildings being used. Now, in London, yes, that they've done all right. Now, there's a few question marks over a few of the facilities, but in general, they've done okay. Athens and Rio are the two really glaring, obvious failures of Olympic legacy, where yeah, they haven't done as well. You could argue Lillehammer as a Winter Olympic venue, yeah, they've done pretty well out of that. Nagano, could you argue that that the Nagano facilities are still well used? The amount of money that governments put in, host nations put into the Olympics, not just host cities, because there'll be venues outside of that host city that they put in and invest. It's really it's going to be interesting to see what actually happens with Tokyo, because the Japanese government's obviously invested so much money, actual direct investment, plus the governing parties put in so much political capital into making sure that these games are a success. I don't think they can afford not to take place next year. That's the thing. I don't think they can afford not to take place, because they've delayed it by 12 months, and that's could be a blessing in disguise getting the Olympics up and running. But sponsors want a return on investment. The TV companies want as many people as possible to view and watch, because they've paid for all this. And of course, fans aren't going at the moment until travel restrictions are eased. Financially, it's going to make a loss. Now, whether long term, they did very well with the Rugby World Cup. Let's not kid ourselves. The Rugby World Cup, they did very, very well last year in getting that tournament ahead, even with the typhoon that hit, and they still managed to pull the tournament off really well, and get that tournament going, and got it organised very, very well. The Japanese did very, very well with the Rugby World Cup last year. The Olympics, it's going to be interesting to see if we actually have fans in attendance, and how it all works out. Really, it's going to be very, very interesting. But we'll have to see what happens, and we'll just we'll have to see how much money they can recoup, because there's going to be a loss made, I think, by the Japanese government. I think they resigned themselves to the fact that they are going to lose money on this Olympics. I don't know. It's all to do with travel restrictions. There's still massive travel restrictions. If you do travel somewhere, you have to quarantine for anywhere from between 7 and 14 days, and you have to self-isolate. So it's going to be interesting to see this time next year what the travel restrictions are like. But we just don't know. But what is interesting is I was doing some bit of reading up on the Spanish flu, swine flu, bird flu, SARS, MERS, and now this coronavirus. It's generally a year to 2 years it takes for a couple of waves, and it's gone. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the Northern Hemisphere winter and the Southern Hemisphere summer. That'll be interesting. And looking at the Southern Hemisphere, they dealt with it in interesting fashion. There's a lot of people who live in the Southern Hemisphere, in South America and Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Island nations and all that. And obviously, Brazil obviously was a bit of a mess. But apart from Brazil, and I think Peru, most of South America dealt with the coronavirus pandemic quite well, and most of the Australasia, the infection rate was kept very, very low, and there weren't a lot of infections in the Southern Hemisphere. So we'll see what happens. So the Southern Hemisphere's got through their winter months, their flu season, without being too badly affected. So we'll see what happens with that. But we'll have to see what happens, and then yeah, that's how crazy it is. Some of these countries already have a lack of international travel anyway. They weren't overly affected. Um, Others just, yeah, like Fiji, I think, have one case, which is mad 'cause it's a tourist hotspot. Vietnam had a very low infection rate, and that's a heavily populated country with an improving health system, but it borders China. Japan, actually surprising for a northern hemisphere country, really did rather well. But as we're seeing in Europe and North America's never really calmed down. I mean, the US is a mess, but as we've seen in Europe, the cases are starting to rise as university students go back, schools go back. They relaxed restrictions on a lot of industries and workplaces. I mean, I'm going to work tomorrow. I've got a 1 day contract job. Uh, that's just come through. I'm waiting for my other new job to start. I've just got a contract job, so you know, it, so there's still employment out there. People go, oh, the economy's had it. I can still get employment. How that affects sport, however, is interesting. So I've got a job tomorrow, unloading a couple of container trucks up by the River Thames. I think it's for the suspension bridge. So I've got a job on a building site for a day, basically. Um, so all I'm doing is unloading the back of a truck, basically, which is fun. So I've got a day of just basically unloading back of a lorry, which is going to be fun. So yeah, um, I'm just working, yeah, just emptying the back of a truck, really. So yeah, there's clearly employment out there. There's clearly things happening. So I don't know. Oh, that gets brilliant. Now the cheaters are preparing to sue their governing body. I mean, you can see what's happening now, because the issue with the Pro 14 and the Southern Kings going out of business, rugby union's in a mess financially. It's a mess financially. I mean, we've already seen issues with the Welsh Rugby Union before COVID. In the build up to the World Cup, there were concerns that players would come back from the World Cup and they wouldn't have clubs to play for. They weren't certain about where they were going to be, and all this. So you know, these concerns are nothing new. But the fact that the cheaters are preparing to sue the South African Rugby Union at a time when the South African Rugby Union has no money because Super Rugby hasn't taken place in its normal format, that's it's just a mess. It does nothing for the image of the sport when you've got teams and the governing bodies at war with each other. But we've seen this in other sports as well, where there's I'm surprised Western Force didn't do the same with Rugby Australia. Quite frankly, it, it it doesn't look good though when you do have one of your biggest, the cheaters suing Southern Kings cheaters. Yeah, this has actually come out. Yeah, the cheaters are gearing up to sue, and they are preparing to go to court. Let's have a read. So 7 hours ago, the cheaters could go to court over the Pro. Now it's on Pro 16, right? I don't want to subscribe to your newsletter. Go away. The cheaters have hired a high-profile advocate as they consider taking legal action should they lose their Pro 14 status. South African rugby bosses are set to meet on Tuesday, which is tomorrow, to vote for the South African franchises that could join an expanded Pro 16 tournament next year. Reports have suggested that four South African Super Rugby franchises, the Stormers, the Bulls, the Sharks, and the Lions, are favoured to join the revamped Northern Hemisphere club competition. This will leave the Cheetahs and Kings, who've been involved in the Pro 14 for 3 years, out in the cold again after they were kicked out of Super Rugby when the Southern Hemisphere tournament was reduced to 15 teams. The Kings have already revealed that they will not be participating in the 2 domestic competitions this year and have since been placed in liquidation by the South African Rugby Union, and the financial struggles could affect their chances of retaining their place in the Pro 14. However, the Cheetahs are determined to keep their place in the competition as well as retain their franchise status. According to uh, South African news website Network 24, the Free State team has reached out to advocate Wim Tengrove to assist them in potential legal battle with South African Rugby. The report revealed that they should Tuesday's fight go against the Cheetahs. They're prepared to take legal action against South African Rugby. The Cheetahs have a contract with SA Rugby to play in the Pro 14 until 2023, which could work in their favour. The Cheetahs could lose in the region of 30 million rand per annum, which I think is about £7 million if they're kicked out of Pro 14. An alternative plan could be join a Super 8 tournament with Australia or New Zealand, but this is something that is believed not to sit well with the Chiefs' bosses. So that is interesting. So the Southern Kings, look, they're contracted till 2023. That's a legally binding contract. So they have that documentation in their favour. They want to keep their franchise status. They want to stay in a competition that I think they have added value to. But the Salazar Nations, Super Rugby as it is, was not going to survive long term. There was already cracks starting to show when the Sunwolves were basically invited to join, then told, I want you anymore. When they expanded to 20, then dropped back to 15 or 18, or I can't remember what it was. When Western Force and the Southern Kings and the Cheetahs went into other rugby competitions, Super Rugby as a format has been creaking for a few years now. And it wasn't doing financially well. Plain and simple. It wasn't doing as well financially. There was empty seats in stadiums in countries that are rugby mad. Let's not forget this. New Zealand and South Africa are stupidly passionate about their rugby union. Australia, obviously, they've got a core fan base. But if you look at Super Rugby matches in Australia versus NRL and Aussie rules on before COVID, lots of empty seats. Lots of empty seats. And this is something that's been dogging Super Rugby for quite some time. Then you add the Jaguares and the Sunwolves, and you expand the competition, and that's fine. That's fine. Problem is, it didn't become sustainable. Quite frankly, a lot of travel distances, time zone differences, and you're trying to sell a product around the world. You're playing on 3 continents, a competition. And there was already historical mistrust between South Africa and New Zealand anyway. It was the All Blacks that didn't want the Springboks joining the Salazar competition in the first place. And then you got the Rugby Championship, the Tri Nations as it used to be, and now Argentina have joined the Rugby, Championship. But financially, Super Rugby was creaking before COVID. COVID exposed the flaws in the Super Rugby system. And this is where professionalism hasn't worked properly. Australian Rugby Union's in financial turmoil. They've lost Qantas as their main title sponsor, so their money's going to be tight. New Zealand, it's a rugby mad nation, but can it keep sustaining itself? Because there's a limited amount of corporate money in New Zealand. There's a population of about 5 million people. It needs a Trans-Tasman competition to be viable. Plain and simple. It cannot survive just New Zealand by itself. It just doesn't have the money. And this is where Europe looks attractive. But now you've got the South African teams, basically. The South African franchises want to leave Super Rugby. So it already says to me that Super Rugby is doomed in its traditional format. I can see some kind of work Trans-Tasman, like Australia and New Zealand, maybe some Pacific Island nations having teams and franchises. I can't see the professional game being sustained at the Super Rugby level. It's just you've got international travel in there, which means you've got quarantine. The whole thing has become unsustainable. What happens long term? I don't know. This is what World Rugby's got to suss out. But you're noticing the amount of Southern Hemisphere talent that's leaving the game in New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Argentina, and looking at the Northern Hemisphere competitions where they can get paid more. And now that the Cheetahs are bringing this possible legal action, we'll find out tomorrow what happens. And the stronger, and I will admit these are the stronger franchises, are looking at joining a revamped European Pro League competition. That tells you when you know about the state of the financial state of rugby in the Southern Hemisphere. Yeah, they've won all the World Cups apart from one, but financially, the domestic game is in crisis. Financially, rugby union at domestic level is in crisis, absolute crisis. Ooh. Hello? Oh, hello. Yes, I did, yeah. Yeah. Not a problem. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye. So yeah, back on not dealing with work. When it comes to the Super Rugby format, I think financially it was struggling for the last couple of years, and then the travel distances it just doesn't, it's not viable. So what happens to the Jaguares then? I know there's going to be a professional South American league similar to Major League Rugby in North America and Canada coming along. So does that mean the Jaguares aren't involved with Super Rugby anymore? The fact the South African Rugby Union are looking at the Northern Hemisphere to align their teams with Italy and Ireland and Scotland and Wales and their Pro League competition is a sign that there's been a breakdown in there's been a massive breakdown in the Salazar nations. But long-term Super Rugby, I don't think was viable. I think they overexpanded. They didn't sustain the finance. They didn't keep professionalism hasn't worked as it should have. The money isn't distributed evenly. It's the same teams winning year after year. Always the same teams winning year after year. And then you have to look at the domestic competitions as well and how viable they are. And the fact they have to rely on the franchise system tells you the state of their domestic competitions below the top level. It's not great financially. Crowd numbers aren't great, and you have to look at the crowd numbers and the finances to work out there's not a lot of money at professional rugby union at club level. International level rugby union is brilliant. I have no doubt. The international game is brilliant. Club level, I'm not a massive fan of club rugby union. It's I wouldn't say it's not a great watch. It's just so badly governed, badly organised, and badly financed that it's as it currently stands unsustainable. Club rugby union is not in a good financial position right now, and that impacts on the national sides. And Super Rugby sums up how bad things are, because what was Super Rugby up until last year is completely collapsed into a New Zealand competition, Australian competition, South African competition. It's fragmented. So I don't know what happens long term, but if the Cheetahs do take legal action, that then becomes interesting. It would be interesting if the Jaguares were allowed to join and make it an 18-team pro league, because then the Cheetahs could stay, and then you could have Argentinian team in there. But again, the travel distances, and at the moment with travel, not travel bans as such, but quarantine restrictions and travel restrictions in place, it does make it not very viable long term anyway. So it's a wait and see approach. We'll have to see what happens. We'll see how this plays out, but Super Rugby as it was is dead. I think the only way for Super Rugby to survive in any kind of format is like an Australian, New Zealand based competition similar to the NRL. I think that's the only way it's going to be viable long term. It reduces travel costs. There's already trade arrangements between Australia and New Zealand and travel corridors between Australia and New Zealand, and visa arrangements. There's already a trade partnership there. Makes things far well, it is surprising that domestic professional rugby union isn't very viable. And you have to ask the questions why. The sport only turned fully professional in 1995, so there's your first issue: is it's only been a professional sport for 25 years. Um, so the money isn't evenly distributed, and at the lower levels, the crowd numbers just aren't there. The interest of fans just really isn't there. It it has to be a failure of those in charge and those trying to market the game as a professional sport. Rugby league has always been known as the professional code since the 60s and 50s. Um, but yeah, the big problem is rugby union's been playing catch up at the club level when it comes to professionalism, and you just have to go and look at the NRL and look how much more those players are paid on average than rugby union players throughout the grades. And even at the semi-pro ranks, they're still paid more. So there is an issue of governance where the money comes from, sponsorships. It's seen in some parts of the world as a very elitist, um, middle to upper class sport, which is partly true historically, although not necessarily the case now uh, in the world today. But you have to look at the origins of the sport and who plays it, and it is seen as a very middle class activity. And the media doesn't not, um, the media does push that stereotype to a point, that it's seen as a public schoolboys game, even though it is played in state schools as well. So yeah, they're, you could say it's a failure of those in charge and the governance of the game and the direction that the game's taking, and is it reaching the wider audience, because it's got to compete on a professional side of sports with rugby league and football in this country, and it's got to compete with rugby league and AFL, soccer in Australia. It's got to compete with rugby league and soccer to a point in New Zealand. Although New Zealand is far better followed, there's better crowds in New Zealand. France, it's very well supported. There are good crowds in France at the club game, at the club level. But there's so few for professional registered players. It's ridiculous. You look how many registered professionals and registered players that are eligible to play for these countries. It's not a lot. You could argue at the professional level there are issues with the reach, the media coverage, sponsors being interested, and you have to think it is competing against more established professional sports that have really good TV deals. I think looking at it, the NRL does have flaws. It's not a perfect system, but that is a national competition that then has regional competitions beneath it to keep providing players, and there's more people playing it. It's got a better TV deal. It's got a better sponsorship. It's got better sponsorship deals. It's got better average crowd numbers. More people playing, more people watching. Same with AFL. There's a much wider social reach of the sport, and it's not seen as just an upper class old boys sport. It's seen as a sport for everyone. And rugby union does have some issues, and I think the people in charge of the sport, doesn't matter if in the Southern Hemisphere, they need to look at themselves and go, "I'm governing the sport in the right way. Is the sport going in the right direction?" And you look at the two top paid leagues in the world, and that's the French league and the English league. They're the ones that pay the highest wages. And in France, it's sustainable. In England, not so much, because it is fighting a battle against the more established professional sports, where average salaries are higher, and football is one of those sports. But now you're looking at it, and professional sport as a of course, this is where cricket's having problems, and facing difficulty is its lack of visibility in the media because it's on a subscription only status with Sky, and the limited visibility of the sport on free to air TV, which is what fans are crying out for, has harmed the sport's image. Rugby League again has got a poor media presence, although the Challenge Cup and internationals are on free to air TV. And that's in this country. But on the whole, yeah, professional sport is at a crossroads right now, and rugby union again. The question has to be asked why, because there have been some very generous TV deals. Oh yeah, there's been some very generous TV deals over the last two and a half decades to do with professionalism in the game. Where's the money gone? They make a lot of money out of the Six Nations. They made a lot of money out of the Heineken Cup, or the European Cup as it is now. They make a lot of money out of these competitions. So the question has to be asked, where's the money gone? Look, basketball's got its own image problem. It's seen as an American sport, and a lot of people are resistant to the Americanization of European sports, the European sports scene. That's a cultural thing. There is a certain resistance in some countries. There are certain laws put in place to protect national culture, and a lot of that's to do with the Americanization. You'll see that in France. They get very resistant to some of the Americanization that's occurring, and they do get very, very resistant to it. There is some resistance there, and yeah. So, but also it's we don't really have that many massive arenas in this country, and then when we do, can you fixture in can basketball make enough money to afford to rent the space in these arenas to make it economically viable? And the answer is no. It cannot, unless it's an NBA game with the Boston Celtics or whoever come over at the play at the O2, which they do every year on the international series. It's not economically viable. So there's a lack of interest from venue owners to host basketball because they're not going to make enough money on the return. We do with money, a lot of it. But again, there is interest there. There are basketball fans in this country. There's but I think there is a resistance, and rightly so. I think that in itself is a social thing. But we'll see what happens. Like at the end of the day, yeah, in France it is around language as well, but there is some sporting resistance there, and the same here. There's already established professional sports. The debate about like having an NFL team in London, for example, that's been going on for the better part of 2 decades. But there's a reason why NFL Europe failed. There is a reason why NFL Europe failed, and there is a reason why the NFL will not have a team in London permanently. For all the press releases and all the speculation, there won't be a team in London. The NFL Players Association, will not agree to it. The travel distances, tax arrangements, they would have to register us here to live. And when they, yes, the NBA, the Major League Baseball, the NHL, the NFL take games on the road, there will be resistance to a permanent team being placed over here. And what we've seen from European teams and European leagues when they want to take their sports over, it's either pre-season or not at all. You do not take regular season games. You take off one-off internationals maybe, but you don't take regular season games. There's a resistance from the domestic-based fans, and if that resistance is not going away. We saw it from Spanish football fans when La Liga basically said, we plan to play games in the US, and the fans went, no, you're not. We'll boycott. And then the players were like, actually, yeah, we're not willing to do it. and they threatened to go on strike. So yeah, we have seen rugby union and rugby league matches take place, internationals and pre-season games take place. When it comes to regular season games, there is a massive resistance to doing it. TV executives want to do it. The club owners and the leagues want to do it. Players and the fans, they don't want to do it so much. They're more resistant. So that's an interesting one. On that kind of thing. There's a lot of resistance to taking matches overseas, which I don't think the leagues were realising until they saw Spanish football players said no and the fans said no. I think the sport's now realising we might have milked the cash cow a bit too much. We are seeing resistance to that idea. But then when they say it's harming the development of the sport, well, people harming the development of the sport are you guys who run the sport, because the sport would be growing healthily if you idiots governed it properly. That's sort of what the feedback you get from a lot of fans is: sport would be in a healthier place if the people governing the sports actually did a better job. So when I get asked the question, who's the best sport governance, I think none of them do pretty well, to be honest. I think you could argue that they all have their own issues, but some have more issues than others. And you look at European football. America has a lot of professional sports. That doesn't mean they're necessarily well governed or they're actually that great to watch. Baseball is just like watching paint dry. Basketball is like, oh, they've scored 250 points in this game. Great. There's only 8 people playing it. Amazing. Cool. NFL is, oh, they're giving each other concussion all the time. And they stop every 5 seconds. So all you actually see is about 8 minutes of actual play. Major League Soccer, okay, it's football, so it's acceptable. Major League Rugby, okay, it's early stages, but they seem to be moving in the right direction. It's rugby. Ice hockey, of course, I love the sport of ice hockey, but there's some issues there with the governance of the sport, which drive me insane on a daily basis. I sometimes look at some of the decisions the NHL have made, and I'm like, why are you doing this? Like, this is ridiculous. Let's have a look at this. What have we got? Right, so I've got to buy food. Cool. But no, the issue with sports governance, the NHL makes a lot of decisions that make no logical sense to me. It's my favourite North American sport, but they do make a lot of decisions that make no sense to me, and I'm left scratching my head as a lifelong hockey fan. I'm like, what are these people doing? There's been 3 lockouts. There's been 1 player strike in my lifetime. There's been a lot of labour unrest. So every time the CBA comes up for renewal, you're like, oh, the talks are going to break down. They're going on strike again. Just because America has so many professional sports doesn't mean they're well run. That's something that I think people need to be aware of. I mean, Major League Baseball I don't even know how people can watch that personally. I just do not know how people can watch baseball. I'm not saying it's a bad sport, I don't know how people can do it. It's not a sport I can get into. I've tried. God, I've tried. Even with energy drink, I still fell asleep. And I'm not joking, even pumping myself with caffeine, I still fell asleep watching it. So it can't keep me interested. But yeah, there's certain professional sports that I just don't like. I'm not saying they're bad, I just don't like them. The sports that I like are the sports that I like. I mean, I have a passion for certain sports. That ain't going to change. But I still ask the question: why is this governing body making this decision? Why is this league making that decision? I do question a lot of the decision-making governance processes that are in place, because it could be better. Things could be a lot better. What the fuck's that? Oh fuck! I've broken my bloody laptops. But no, there is, I think, a proportion of Major League Baseball fans. I mean, there's a reason why Major League Baseball chose to have a London series last year. But how successful was that? You'd have to look at the the match day revenue, how many tickets they sold for the 4 games that were played, the actual interest from fans in regards to going to games and watching games. I think they could have done a better job at advertising it and selling the product. I'm not going to lie, they could have done a better job last year. Using Jimmy Carr as part of the advertising campaign didn't go down well with a lot of people on social media. I seem to remember a lot of people were like, "Well, I'm definitely not watching it now," because Jimmy Carr is a very divisive figure, and that didn't go down well. Oh yeah, I'm not. I mean, London's a very cosmopolitan, very global city. I'm not disputing that. There's a lot of people from around the world. Uh, but how many of those people are actually British citizens? How many of them are actually the average sports fan in this country that's been here their entire lives and that are new fans, not existing fans? Major League Baseball doesn't want existing fans; it wants new fans. It wants to grow its product. If you already have existing fans, it doesn't matter where they are in the world, you're not growing your product because you're still selling the merchandise. They're still buying the online services. They're still watching games online or with whatever satellite TV package. You want to grow the product to a wider fan base, and then you want to look at the TV response. I don't think it went down that well. I think reviews were mixed from a lot of people about how Major League Baseball's London series went, how successful it was. The fact they were originally going to come 3 years ago and then they cancelled that idea, I think damaged the brand of Major League Baseball going forward. And they were the last of the 4 major North American sports to come over here and bring games here, be it pre-season or regular season games. So they're already behind them. The NHL's been coming here since the 30s, and still come to Europe today. Not to the UK, but to Europe. The NFL, the NBA have been coming again to Europe since the 90s, and the NFL have been doing it since 2007. So they're well behind the other, North American leagues. There is already a massive market for ice hockey here. The NHL doesn't need to grow its product. It needs to sustain its product because the best European players go and play North America. It gives something back to the fan base. They know there's a massive fan base here. They know it's the second most popular sport, on the continent. The NBA, they know it's very popular. Again, continental Europe. They know some of the big cities are very cosmopolitan, very global. Again, they're trying to attract new fans and grow the brand. Fine. NBA's been doing it for 30 years. NFL, they were very, very keen on having a team in London because of the success of the initial NFL series 2007, 2008, the early days. Then the financial crash happened. There are still plans on the table to have a team in London, but I don't think they have. Just don't think it happens. But again, the NFL wants to grow the brand. And yeah, there's a fair few NFL fans in the UK. I'm not denying that, but I think that idea is starting to just get a little bit. Some of the sparkle's gone off of it. When it initially first happened, I was like, this is actually quite interesting. First couple of years, and then as the years went by, I became less and less interested in the NFL series games. It just naturally, I just started to lose a bit of interest and a bit of enjoyment out of it. And in recent years, I haven't bothered watching. So I think that's lost that initial sparkle because the team didn't come along. There was always rumours about having a team in London, and then when Shahid Khan tried to buy Wembley and tried to implant a crap Jacksonville Jaguars team, let's not kid ourselves. The Jaguars are bad. You're just moving a hopeless team from Jacksonville that can't draw fans to London, and they're still going to be hopeless. There is no change in the hopelessness of that team. But no, when the Boston Celtics CEO was interviewed, I think back in 2018, after the Boston Celtics had a double-header set of games at the O2, the former Millennium Dome for those who are old enough. He was interviewed, and the reporter said, "What's the likelihood of having a North American franchise from one of the major leagues here in London or in Europe? Because they do take games across Europe." And he went, "It's not going to happen. Doesn't make any financial sense. That ship sailed before the financial crash." So, yes, there were plans on the table to have an NFL team here. They were planning to have an NFL team here by, I think, 2016, 2017. That ship sailed. Long gone. With the NFL planning, they were hoping to have a team here within the decade from 2007. So we're looking at, about 2016, 2017. Yeah, that ship's gone years ago. Still ain't got a team here. I don't think it happens I don't think it happens now with what's happened with coronavirus and the travel distances. The NFLPA were already kicking off about games possibly taking place in Mexico City. So if you can't get the players on board and they have a big voice, they can just go on strike. They're not keen on it. And there's collective bargaining agreement coming up next year. So there will be discussions on the table. You've got to get all the owners to agree to. I think it's 2/3 majority. And then you've got to try, and if they let's say you've got to have 8 home games a season, every season. What stadium do you use? Do you use Wembley? Do you use Tottenham? Do you split 4 and 4 because of fixturing with other sports? Because you've got to remember, Wembley's not only used for football, and Tottenham, obviously, they play at White Hart Lane as well. Then Twickenham, Rugby Union. So these other stadiums aren't just used for one sport, they're used for multiple sports. So they're multi-sport venues. You've got the Rugby League World Cup next year, which will be using the Emirates, which is another stadium that could host NFL games. And the organiser of that will probably not want to clash with the NFL. So it's going to be an interesting one to see what happens with an NFL team ever coming to London permanently. But I don't see it happening. And now with the Rugby League World Cup next year, and that's going to be interesting. The fact they're not using Wembley, I think, is because the NFL games will be taking place there, so there might be a clash. But I don't know how much longer the NFL series in London will continue. I know Tottenham built their stadium with that idea in mind, because the NFL has signed contracts with both Wembley and White Hart Lane in order to host games, but I don't know how long that continues long term, and the viability of it long term. But we'll have to wait and see what happens in the next 12, 24 months with this pandemic and what happens post-pandemic, and we'll see what happens going forward. But I don't know. I don't see how it can be viable long term. But we'll still look at rugby. Look at the Pro League. I mean, the South African team is joining the Pro 12 and now making it the Pro 14. Hopefully, the Pro 16. That is an interesting subplot. But then we look at what's happened with Super Rugby when you have a league scattered all across multiple time zones and multiple continents. As we found out, that becomes a problem. Finances become an issue. Travel becomes a problem. And look at Super Rugby. It's a prime example of something that hasn't worked. Transcontinental league. So, and the Pro League, the Southern Kings have been liquidated. So, and there's discussions about what the structure of the Pro League's looking like. So these transcontinental leagues and international leagues, there's only so long they can last before cracks start appearing and it all falls tumbling down. And rugby is an example where it's not worked very well. So we'll have to see what happens with the NFL and having a team in London. They're still keen on it, apparently, but I think that ship sailed and it just keeps getting pushed further and further down the road. I think the financial crash has something to do with it. I think the coronavirus will have something to do with it not happening. But there we go. It's that's an open-ended debate. We haven't even got on discussion the VAR situation over the weekend, or some of the other situations in professional sport, like Lewis Hamilton not winning a race, which was well received by many, and the FIA bringing rules on post-race protests, which Lewis Hamilton will say, "Oh, he's racist." No, it's just because you're a knob. But that's another thing. I'm not a fan of Lewis Hamilton, not because of the colour of skin, because he's a cunt. What was that? That's my personal opinion on Lewis Hamilton. I'm not a fan of Lewis Hamilton, not because he's very good at what he does. He is. It's because I think he's an arse. Simple. Anyway. But, sport is what it is. Anyway, I'm going to leave that there because we didn't actually discuss what I really wanted to discuss, which was the issues with VAR and such. But we ended up discussing, other sports around the world, and the situation with South African Rugby Union, the Cheetahs threatening to sue their governing body over their position in the Pro League because they're contracted in the Pro League until 2023. That's an interesting one, and that is a developing story that I think will have bigger ramifications for the structures of club rugby union in Europe and South Africa. But Super Rugby, I think, is dead. I think coming out of this, Rugby Australia, the New Zealand Rugby Union, the South African Rugby Union, the Argentinian Rugby Union, the European Rugby Union, I think club rugby needs to restructure itself and look at the finances and look at the expenditure and how sustainable it can be long term. Because at the moment, it looks like it's going to go bust. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I'll have some more videos for you very, very soon.